Hi, in this session we are going to understand what are overheads. So what is overheads? Overheads are nothing but expenditures. But what is important is what kind of expenditure. This is an expenditure which you cannot trace, which you cannot identify with any particular cost of the product. So this is an expenditure which is incurred, but you cannot trace this expenditure or you cannot identify this expenditure with any particular cost unit. So it means that these expenditures are incurred generally. It is incurred for a common purpose. It is not incurred only for rendering a particular service. It is not incurred only for a particular product, but it is incurred for a general output. Say for example, you pay salary to your security staff. So this salary paid to security staff is not something confined to a particular product or a particular service, but it is incurred in common. And say you incur some lighting expenses, heating expenses of factory, all these are all going to be common expenses. So overheads are very important cost. When we arrive at the cost where we factor many cost, overheads occupies a very important position along with direct material cost, direct labor cost. Many times in manufacturing concern, this overhead cost would be greater than direct material. It may also sometimes be greater than direct labor, and sometimes it will be greater than putting both a direct material and direct labor both. So because of this cost is very important when we work out what is the total cost incurred by an organization. So if you don't consider this cost while arriving at the cost of a job, then probably will be making a big mistake, because this is going to be greater than material cost, this is going to be greater than labor cost, sometimes it will be greater than both. So if you are going to ignore this overhead for arriving at the cost of a job or a cost of a product, or even for controlling purpose, then you will be making a grave mistake. So what you have to understand is overheads represents expenses that have been incurred in providing certain ancillary facilities or for services which actually facilitate or make possible for carrying out the production process. So overhead is basically incurred to facilitate your process. Sometimes it may not be directly related to facilitating also, but still if you don't incur that expenditure, you may not be able to run your organization for some or the other reasons. Okay. So what we have to understand is overheads are not only incurred in the production process, but it is also incurred in administration process. It is also incurred in selling and distribution processes. So understand overheads are basically expenses which you cannot directly trace with a particular product or a particular process, but it is incurred in common or in general to facilitate all the process in the organization. Now we have fair idea about what are overheads. There are various classifications in overheads. Let's see what are the classification of overheads first. Number one, we can classify the overheads based on function. So under functional classification, we can have overheads like a factory overhead. Then we can have overheads like office and admin overhead. Then we can have selling and distribution overheads. So these are all can be the functional classification of overheads. Then by nature we can have a classification of overheads. That is, overheads can be classified as per nature. Under that we can have fixed overhead, that is number one. Then we can have a variable overhead, and the third category should be a semi-variable overhead. The third classification of the overhead can be based on element, where we can have different kinds like indirect material, then we can have indirect labor, then we can have indirect expenses, because overheads are basically indirect expenses. So by element we can say the expenses incurred on indirect material, expenses incurred on indirect labor, expenses incurred on indirect expenses. So there is also a fourth classification that is possible. We can call it, or we can classify it on the basis of controllability. So based on controllability, we can classify the overheads into controllable overheads or controllable cost. The other one is going to be uncontrollable cost. So these are all the classification of overheads. We understand overheads are basically indirect expenses because they cannot be directly identified with a product or service. So these overheads are classified into four groups based on functions, based on nature, based on element, and based on controllability. And under that we have certain sub classification. We'll see one by one in the next session.